Marcus Johnson stood in front of his new home, keys dangling from his fingers. The two-story house with its fresh blue paint and white trim looked perfect for his family. After 20 years of police work in Chicago, this peaceful suburb of Oak Ridge represented everything he had worked for: a safer place to raise his teenage children and a prestigious position as the town's new chief of police. "What do you think, honey?" he asked his wife Tanya, who was directing the movers with their furniture. "It's beautiful, Marcus. Just like in the pictures," she replied, squeezing his hand. Their children, Zoe and Isaiah, were already exploring the front yard, pointing at the tire swing hanging from the large oak tree. The neighborhood was quiet, with neat lawns and well-maintained homes. It was early autumn, and the trees were just beginning to change color. As the moving truck rumbled in the driveway, Marcus noticed a man across the street. The neighbor stood on his porch with arms crossed, watching them intently. When Marcus raised his hand in a friendly wave, the man's face hardened. He turned and went inside his house without acknowledging the greeting. "Don't worry about it," Tanya said, noticing her husband's slight frown. "He's probably just having a bad day." Marcus nodded but couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling. In his years as a police officer, he had developed a strong sense for tension, and something about the neighbor's stare felt hostile. Later that afternoon, as Marcus carried boxes to the garage, he spotted the man again. This time, the neighbor was in his front yard, talking to another resident. Their conversation stopped abruptly when they noticed Marcus looking their way. "That must be Richard Coleman," said Mrs. Parker, an elderly woman who had stopped by earlier with a welcome basket. "He's lived here for almost 30 years, keeps to himself mostly, but he's very active in the neighborhood watch." That evening, after the movers left, the Johnson family sat on their new porch eating pizza. The street was peaceful as the sun set, casting long shadows across their lawn. Marcus felt a weight lift from his shoulders. After years of dealing with big city crime, the calm of Oak Ridge was exactly what they needed. "When do you start at the station?" Tanya asked, leaning against his shoulder. "Monday. The mayor wants to formally introduce me at next week's town meeting, but I'll be meeting my officers before that." "Dad, are people here going to be weird about us?" Isaiah asked suddenly. At 15, he was already perceptive about racial dynamics. Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "Some might be. Oak Ridge is changing, but not everyone welcomes change. Remember what I always tell you both: we lead by example." Just then, a car slowed as it passed their house. Richard Coleman was driving, and he stared at the Johnson family with an expression that made Marcus's police instincts flare. It wasn't curiosity, it was contempt. "I think we should introduce ourselves to the neighbors tomorrow," Marcus said, watching the car disappear down the street. "It's always good to build connections early." That night, after the children were asleep, Marcus stood at his bedroom window. Most houses were dark, but across the street, Richard Coleman's porch light was on. The man was sitting there, looking directly at the Johnson home. Marcus closed the curtains and took a deep breath. 20 years on the force had taught him that prejudice existed everywhere, even in quiet suburbs like Oak Ridge. As the first black chief of police in the town's history, he had expected some resistance. What he didn't know was just how dangerous that resistance would become. The first week in Oak Ridge passed quickly for Marcus Johnson. Each morning, he put on his crisp new uniform with the chief of police badge and drove to the station. The officers under his command were polite but reserved. Marcus understood. Change was always difficult, especially when that change came in the form of an outsider from Chicago. "Give them time," Captain Reynolds had advised. A 20-year veteran of the Oak Ridge Police Department, Reynolds was the only one who seemed genuinely welcoming. Small towns move slow, but once they accept you, they're loyal for life. At home, the Johnson family was settling in. Zoe and Isaiah had started at their new school, and Tanya was unpacking the last of their belongings. Only one thing troubled their peace: Richard Coleman's growing hostility. It began with small incidents. When Marcus collected the mail on Tuesday, he found someone had scribbled "Go Home" in marker across their mailbox. He cleaned it off without telling Tanya, not wanting to worry her. On Thursday morning, Marcus noticed Richard taking photos of their house from across the street. When Marcus approached him, Richard quickly got into his car and drove away. "Something strange happened today," Tanya said when Marcus returned from work that evening. "A group of women invited me to join their book club. When I showed up, they claimed there must have been a mistake. They said the club was full. Marcus sighed and put his arm around her shoulders. It'll take time, honey. We knew that coming in. The following Monday, Marcus found a flyer on his car windshield. It announced a neighborhood watch meeting at Richard Coleman's house. What caught his attention was the line, "Discuss recent security concerns in our community." Marcus decided to attend. That evening, he walked across the street in casual clothes. No uniform, no badge. When Richard opened the door, his smile vanished instantly. "This is a private meeting," Richard said, blocking the entrance. "I'm your neighbor," Marcus replied calmly, "and I believe community safety concerns everyone." Richard's face reddened. "Look, you people might not understand how things work here." "You people?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. A woman appeared behind Richard. "Let him in, Richard. He has as much right to be here as anyone." Reluctantly, Richard stepped aside. Inside, about 15 neighbors sat in Richard's living room. Conversation stopped when Marcus entered. He recognized some faces, people who had avoided eye contact when his family waved hello. "Since our new neighbor is here," Richard said, emphasizing the word strangely, "let's discuss the increase in suspicious activity lately." "What suspicious activity?" asked an elderly man. Richard pointed at a paper with crude statistics. "Property values dropping. Strangers in the neighborhood. Cars driving slowly past houses." His eyes flickered to Marcus. "We need to protect what's ours." Marcus listened quietly as Richard spoke about maintaining neighborhood standards and preserving community character, phrases that barely disguised the real message. Finally, Marcus stood up. "I appreciate everyone's concern for safety. As someone with 20 years in law enforcement, I can tell you that the best way to keep a community safe is by working together, not by dividing it." The room fell silent. Some neighbors looked embarrassed. "You're a cop?" someone asked. Before Marcus could answer, Richard interrupted. "That's irrelevant. The point is." Actually, the woman who had let Marcus in spoke up. "I think it's very relevant. Maybe we should listen to someone with experience." Richard's face darkened. As the meeting broke up, he cornered Marcus by the door. "I don't care what you did in Chicago," he hissed, too quietly for others to hear. "You don't belong here, and you never will. This neighborhood has standards." Marcus looked him straight in the eye. "Standards like respect and decency, I completely agree." Walking home under the streetlights, Marcus felt eyes watching from windows. He had faced prejudice before, but something about Richard's hatred felt dangerous. Tomorrow was the town meeting where he would be officially introduced as chief. Perhaps then, things would improve. What Marcus didn't know was that Richard Coleman was planning something that would change everything. Saturday morning arrived with perfect autumn weather. Marcus Johnson woke early, as years of police work had trained him to do, even on his day off. He stood on his front porch with a cup of coffee, enjoying the peaceful neighborhood before the rest of his family woke up. The town meeting the previous evening had gone better than expected. Mayor Wilson had proudly introduced Marcus as Oak Ridge's new chief of police, highlighting his impressive career and commendations. Most of the townspeople had applauded politely, though Marcus noticed Richard Coleman and a few others sitting with arms crossed, their faces showing clear disapproval. "Time to finish the yard work," Marcus said to himself. He changed into an old t-shirt and jeans, then headed outside to tackle the overgrown bushes along the fence line. The sun climbed higher as Marcus worked, sweat soaking through his shirt. He was so focused on trimming the hedges that he didn't immediately notice Richard Coleman and another neighbor standing on the sidewalk, watching him. "Property values are already dropping," Richard said loudly, clearly intending for Marcus to hear. "First one family moves in, then more follow. Before you know it, a whole neighborhood changes." The other neighbor, a middle-aged man Marcus hadn't met yet, looked uncomfortable. "I don't think that's necessarily." "Trust me, Bill," Richard interrupted. "I've seen it happen. These people bring their problems with them." Marcus put down his hedge clippers and wiped his forehead with a towel. He had promised Tanya he would try to make peace with the neighbors, even the difficult ones. Taking a deep breath, he walked toward the men with an extended hand. "Good morning. I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm Marcus Johnson." Richard stared at Marcus's outstretched hand but didn't take it. The other neighbor, Bill, hesitantly shook hands. Bill Peterson, he mumbled. Live 3 doors down. Nice to meet you, Bill, Marcus said with a genuine smile. He turned to Richard. And you're Richard Coleman, right? I've been meaning to talk to you about. I have nothing to say to you, Richard snapped. Except that you're not welcome here. Marcus kept his voice calm. I understand change can be difficult, but my family and I are part of this community now. I'll be serving as chief of police for everyone in Oak Ridge, regardless of. Richard let out a harsh laugh. Chief of police? That's what's wrong with this country. They'll give anyone a badge these days. Bill's eyes widened. Richard, maybe we should. No, Bill. Someone needs to say it. Richard stepped closer to Marcus. We had a perfectly good chief before they forced him to retire. Now they bring in some outsider who doesn't understand our community or our values. Marcus felt his jaw tighten but kept his composure. What values would those be, Mr. Coleman? You know exactly what I mean, Richard hissed. Look at what's happening to our street already. Your kids playing that loud music, people I don't recognize coming and going, cars I don't recognize. Those were my colleagues from the police department, Marcus explained evenly. And my children haven't played any loud music. They're too busy adjusting to a new school. Richard's face reddened. Don't contradict me in my own neighborhood. People like you always think you deserve special treatment. People like me? Marcus asked, his voice still calm but firm. Yeah, you people, Richard said, no longer trying to hide his prejudice. You don't belong here. This used to be a good neighborhood. Bill shuffled uncomfortably. I should go. My wife is waiting. He hurried away, leaving Marcus and Richard facing each other. Several neighbors had come out to their porches, watching the confrontation. Marcus was acutely aware that he represented not just himself but his position as chief. Mr. Coleman, Marcus said quietly, I hope someday we can find common ground as neighbors. Until then, I'd appreciate if you kept your comments about my family to yourself. As Marcus turned to walk away, Richard called after him. This isn't over, Johnson. People here know who belongs and who doesn't. Marcus continued walking, his back straight, refusing to give Richard the satisfaction of seeing him angry. Inside, though, he felt a growing concern. 20 years in law enforcement had taught him to recognize when a situation might become dangerous. And something in Richard Coleman's eyes told him this was just the beginning. The day had been long for Marcus Johnson. An emergency budget meeting with the mayor had kept him at City Hall until well past 9 o'clock. Driving home through the quiet streets of Oak Ridge, he reflected on his first 3 weeks as chief of police. Despite Richard Coleman's hostility, most of the town was slowly warming to him. His officers were beginning to trust his leadership, and several community members had stopped by the station to welcome him personally. The night was dark as Marcus turned onto his street. Most houses were already dark, their occupants asleep or winding down for the evening. He noticed immediately that something was wrong. A shadowy figure was hunched beside his car in the driveway. As Marcus pulled closer, his headlights illuminated Richard Coleman kneeling by his front tire, a sharp object in his hand. Marcus parked on the street and stepped out, his police training kicking in automatically. Mr. Coleman, he called firmly. What are you doing to my vehicle? Richard jerked upright, clearly startled. In the dim glow of the street lamp, Marcus could see that his neighbor's eyes were bloodshot, his movements unsteady. The smell of alcohol reached Marcus before Richard even spoke. Just checking your tire pressure, Richard slurred, tucking something into his pocket. Being a good neighbor. Marcus took a cautious step forward. I need you to step away from my car, sir. Don't tell me what to do, Richard spat, his pretense of innocence vanishing. This is my neighborhood. Been here 30 years. Who do you think you are? I'm asking you politely to go home, Mr. Coleman. You appear to be intoxicated, and it's late. Richard's face twisted with anger. You come here with your fancy badge, thinking you're better than everyone. Think you can just take over. Marcus noticed Richard's hand was still in his pocket. Remove your hand slowly and show me what you're holding, he instructed, his voice calm but authoritative. Or what? You gonna shoot me? Richard sneered, swaying slightly. That's what you people do, right? Marcus kept his distance, aware that his family was sleeping inside the house. The last thing he wanted was for this confrontation to wake his children. Mr. Coleman, I'm not going to ask again. Please go home before this situation escalates. Instead of backing away, Richard suddenly lunged forward. Don't talk down to me, he shouted, swinging wildly at Marcus's face. Years of training allowed Marcus to dodge the clumsy blow, but Richard kept coming. His fist connected with Marcus's shoulder, then his jaw. The metallic taste of blood filled Marcus's mouth as his lips split. Marcus could have easily subdued Richard. He'd handled far more dangerous suspects during his career, but he was painfully aware of the optics. A black man, even one in a position of authority, had to be careful in these situations. Stop this right now, Marcus commanded, blocking Richard's next punch without returning it. Richard was beyond reasoning. You don't belong here, he screamed, each word punctuated by another wild swing. One caught Marcus on the cheekbone, sending a flash of pain through his skull. When Richard reached again for his pocket, Marcus had no choice. He grabbed Richard's wrist and twisted it behind his back in a standard restraint hold, careful not to apply too much pressure. Let go of me, Richard howled, struggling uselessly against the professional hold. Calm down and I will, Marcus replied evenly. A small pocket knife clattered to the ground. Marcus kicked it away while maintaining his grip on Richard. Lights came on in neighboring houses. Marcus saw curtains twitching as people peered out to witness the commotion. After a moment, Marcus released his hold. Go home, Mr. Coleman. We'll discuss this when you're sober. Richard stumbled backward, his face twisted with hatred and humiliation. You've made a big mistake, he hissed. A very big mistake. He staggered across the street to his house, fumbling with his door key before disappearing inside. Marcus touched his bleeding lip and bruised cheek, the adrenaline beginning to fade. He inspected his car and found deep scratches along the side panel, clearly made by the knife. As he stood in his driveway, wondering how to explain this to Tanya without worrying her, he saw Richard through his front window. His neighbor was on the phone, gesturing angrily. Marcus didn't need to guess who Richard was calling. Richard Coleman paced back and forth in his living room, phone pressed tightly to his ear. His hands trembled with a mix of alcohol and adrenaline as he waited for the emergency dispatcher to pick up. 911, what's your emergency? A female voice finally answered. I need police at 1478 Oak Ridge Lane immediately, Richard said, his words slightly slurred. There's a dangerous man outside my house. He just attacked me. Sir, are you injured? Do you need medical assistance? The dispatcher asked calmly. No, I'm fine, Richard said impatiently. But you need to send officers now. This man doesn't belong in our neighborhood. He's threatening people. The dispatcher's voice shifted slightly. Can you describe this person, sir? Richard moved to his window, peering through the blinds at Marcus, who was now examining the damage to his car. Black male, about 6 feet tall, athletic build. He's in my neighbor's driveway right now, acting aggressive. I think he might be on drugs or something. There was a slight pause on the line. Sir, what is your name? Richard Coleman. I'm at 1483 Oak Ridge Lane, right across from this guy. I'm the one who called about suspicious activity last week too, but nobody did anything. Mr. Coleman, can you tell me exactly what happened tonight? Richard turned away from the window, his mind racing to construct a story that would justify his actions. I was just taking my evening walk when I noticed this guy lurking around. When I asked what he was doing in our neighborhood, he got aggressive. Started threatening me, saying he could do whatever he wanted here. Then he attacked me. I barely got away. What Richard didn't know was that the dispatcher, Sandra Williams, had been working for the Oak Ridge Police Department for 15 years. She recognized the address immediately. Mr. Coleman, the address you mentioned, 1478 Oak Ridge Lane, that's the residence of Chief Johnson, correct? Richard paused, momentarily confused. What? No, that's where that new family moved in, the man who attacked me. Sandra's voice remained professional but took on a more formal tone. Sir, to confirm, you're reporting an incident involving the person living at 1478 Oak Ridge Lane. Yes. How many times do I have to say it? There's a dangerous man there who doesn't belong in this neighborhood. He assaulted me. Are you going to send someone or not? Sandra typed rapidly on her computer. Officers are being dispatched to your location now, Mr. Coleman. Please remain in your home until they arrive. Richard felt a surge of satisfaction. Good. They'll see I'm right. This neighborhood is going downhill fast with these people moving in. Sir, I need to ask you to stay on the line until officers arrive. Fine, Richard muttered, returning to the window. Through the blinds, he could see Marcus still standing in his driveway, now talking on his phone. Richard smiled grimly, imagining the man's surprise when police cars pulled up. Outside, Marcus was indeed on his phone, but not in the panicked way Richard imagined. He was calmly speaking with Captain Reynolds, the senior officer on duty. Yes, sir, I'm fine. Just a split lip and some bruising, Marcus explained. He was clearly intoxicated. I saw him damaging my vehicle and confronted him, then he became physically aggressive. Do you want to press charges, Chief? Reynolds asked. Let's see how this plays out first. I suspect he's calling this in himself right now. Can you make sure whoever responds knows the situation? Already done, sir. Rodriguez and Patel are on their way. They know it's your address. 2 patrol cars turned onto the street, approaching with lights but no sirens. From his window, Richard watched with growing anticipation. His smile widened as the officers parked and stepped out of their vehicles. They're here, Richard told the dispatcher triumphantly. Now we'll get this sorted out. What Richard didn't realize was that officers Rodriguez and Patel weren't approaching Marcus with caution or aggression. Instead, they walked up to him with clear respect, concern visible on their faces as they noticed his injuries. Richard's smile began to fade as he watched the scene unfold across the street, so different from what he had expected. What's happening? He demanded into the phone. Why aren't they arresting him? But Sandra, the dispatcher, simply replied, The officers will assess the situation, sir. Please continue to stay inside your residence. Officer Rodriguez approached Marcus with concern etched on his young face. Chief Johnson, are you all right, sir? He asked, noticing the blood on Marcus's lip and the bruise forming on his cheekbone. I'm fine, Rodriguez, Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the throbbing pain. Just an unfortunate misunderstanding with my neighbor. Officer Patel, a 5-year veteran of the force, was already examining the damage to Marcus's car. She ran her fingers along the deep scratches in the paint. This doesn't look like a misunderstanding to me, Chief. Looks like vandalism. From across the street, Richard Coleman watched in growing confusion. The officers weren't confronting the man as he had expected. Instead, they were treating him with obvious respect. Richard strained to hear their conversation, but could only make out fragments. Sir, do you need medical attention? Rodriguez asked, pulling out a small flashlight to check Marcus's pupils. No, thank you. Nothing serious, Marcus assured him, though he winced slightly when he touched his swollen lip. Patel spoke into her radio. Dispatch, we're at 1478 Oak Ridge Lane. Chief Johnson has sustained minor injuries following an assault. The suspect is across the street at 1483 Oak Ridge. Richard's mouth fell open as he listened to the dispatcher's voice through his phone. Mr. Coleman, Sandra said, officers have made contact with Chief Johnson and will be approaching your residence shortly. Please remain inside and keep your hands visible when they arrive. Chief Johnson? Richard repeated, his alcohol-fogged brain struggling to process this information. What are you talking about? Before Sandra could respond, there was a firm knock at Richard's front door. He dropped the phone and stumbled to answer it, suddenly aware of how the situation was unraveling. Officer Rodriguez stood on the porch, his expression professional but stern. Mr. Coleman, I'm Officer Rodriguez with the Oak Ridge Police Department. We received a call about a disturbance. Richard tried to regain his composure. Yes, that's right. I called because that man, he pointed across the street, attacked me when I was just taking an evening walk. Rodriguez's face remained impassive. Sir, are you aware who that man is? Some new resident, Richard said dismissively, though doubt was creeping into his voice. He doesn't belong in this neighborhood. Mr. Coleman, that's Chief Marcus Johnson, the head of the Oak Ridge Police Department, Rodriguez stated clearly. He reports that you were vandalizing his vehicle when he arrived home this evening, and that you assaulted him when confronted. The color drained from Richard's face. He gripped the doorframe for support as the reality of his situation crashed down upon him. That's impossible. He can't be. Across the street, Marcus was showing Officer Patel the pocket knife that had fallen during the altercation. The streetlights illuminated his face, highlighting his commanding presence despite his injuries. For the first time, Richard noticed the quiet dignity in the man's bearing, something he had refused to see before. Chief Johnson has injuries consistent with an assault, Rodriguez continued. We also have evidence of vandalism to his vehicle. These are serious offenses, Mr. Coleman. Richard's mind raced desperately. There's been a mistake. I didn't know. I thought he was an intruder. An intruder in his own driveway? Rodriguez asked skeptically. By now, several neighbors had emerged from their homes, watching the scene unfold with undisguised interest. Richard felt their eyes on him, judging him. Marcus crossed the street, walking with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. Despite his casual clothes and injuries, there was no mistaking his role now. He stopped beside Officer Rodriguez, wincing slightly as he spoke. Mr. Coleman, I believe we need to have a serious conversation, Marcus said calmly, holding up his police badge. I'm Chief Marcus Johnson. I moved in 3 weeks ago with my family. And yes, I am the new chief of police for Oak Ridge. Richard stared at the badge, then at Marcus's face, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. His legs nearly gave way beneath him. I didn't know, he stammered, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Would it have made a difference if you had? Marcus asked quietly. Richard had no answer, and the silence that followed said everything. Morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of Marcus Johnson's office at the Oak Ridge Police Department. He sat at his desk, a cup of coffee growing cold beside him as he reviewed the incident report from the previous night. His lip was still swollen, and the bruise on his cheek had darkened to a deep purple. Every officer who entered his office tried not to stare at the injuries, but their concerned glances spoke volumes. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Captain Reynolds entered, carrying a manila folder. The paperwork's ready, Chief, Reynolds said, placing the folder on the desk. Assault charges, vandalism, filing a false police report. The prosecutor says it's a strong case. Coleman could face significant jail time, especially given your position. Marcus nodded, opening the folder to scan the documents. Everything was in order, ready for his signature to move forward with charges against Richard Coleman. Thank you, Reynolds, Marcus said, closing the folder without signing. I'll need some time to think about this. Reynolds hesitated. Sir, with all due respect, what Coleman did was a serious offense. If anyone else had attacked the chief of police, we wouldn't think twice about pressing charges. I know. Marcus touched his bruised cheek gently. But this isn't just about the law. It's about the community we're trying to build. After Reynolds left, Marcus sat alone, contemplating his options. The easy path was clear. Sign the papers, let the justice system take its course. Richard Coleman would face the consequences of his actions. But something told Marcus that punishment alone wouldn't solve the deeper problem. At 5 o'clock, Marcus left the station and drove through town. Instead of turning onto his street, he pulled up in front of Richard Coleman's house. The curtains were drawn, and the property had a deserted appearance, though Marcus knew Richard was inside. The officers had released him with orders not to leave town pending charges. Taking a deep breath, Marcus walked to the front door and knocked firmly. It took several minutes before the door cracked open. Richard's bloodshot eyes widened in surprise when he saw who was standing on his porch. Chief Johnson, he said weakly, his voice barely audible. Mr. Coleman, Marcus replied with a nod. May I come in? I think we need to talk. Richard hesitated, then opened the door wider. The house was dark and cluttered, with empty bottles visible on the coffee table. Richard had clearly been drinking since his release. Come to arrest me properly? Richard asked, his voice a mixture of defiance and resignation. No, Marcus said, remaining standing as Richard slumped into an armchair. I came to understand. Richard looked up in confusion. Understand what? Why you hate me so much? Why the color of my skin threatens you? Why you felt the need to damage my property and attack me? Marcus spoke calmly, without accusation. Because until I understand, nothing will change. Richard stared at his hands, unable to meet Marcus's gaze. You wouldn't get it. Try me, Marcus said, sitting down across from him. For a long moment, Richard remained silent. Then, slowly, Words began to tumble out, disjointed at first, then forming a clearer picture. He talked about losing his job 5 years ago when his company downsized. How his wife had left him soon after. How the neighborhood was the only thing that hadn't changed in his life until now. "I'm not saying it's right," Richard finally mumbled. "But when you moved in, it was like the last thing I recognized was changing too." Marcus listened without interruption, taking in every word. When Richard finally fell silent, Marcus spoke. "I have the paperwork ready to press charges against you," he said simply. "Assault, vandalism, filing a false report. The prosecutor is confident about the case." Richard's shoulders slumped. "I figured as much. But I haven't signed it yet," Marcus continued. "And I'm not sure I will." Richard's head snapped up in surprise. "What?" "Sending you to jail won't fix what's broken here," Marcus explained, gesturing between them. "It won't change how you see me or my family. It won't help this community heal." "So what happens now?" Richard asked, genuine confusion in his voice. Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. "That depends on you, Mr. Coleman. I'm offering you a different path, one that's probably harder than jail time in some ways. A chance to actually face your prejudices instead of hiding behind them." For the first time since they'd met, Richard didn't look away. In the chief's eyes, he saw something unexpected, not hatred or vengeance, but a challenging kind of compassion that was almost more difficult to bear. The Oak Ridge Community Center buzzed with conversation as residents filed in for the monthly town meeting. Extra chairs had been added to accommodate the unusually large turnout. Everyone had heard rumors about what happened between Chief Johnson and Richard Coleman, though few knew the full story. Mayor Wilson stood at the podium, calling the meeting to order. "Before we begin our regular agenda, I'd like to formally introduce someone who has already been making a positive impact on our community. Many of you have met him, but tonight we officially welcome Chief Marcus Johnson to Oak Ridge." The applause was polite but reserved as Marcus walked to the front of the room. His facial bruises had faded but were still visible. He stood tall in his formal police uniform, gold badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Thank you, Mayor Wilson," Marcus began, his deep voice filling the room. "I appreciate the welcome my family and I have received from many of you." He paused, surveying the faces before him. Some friendly, some curious, some still uncertain. "I want to speak honestly tonight. 3 weeks ago, I moved to Oak Ridge believing it could be a community where my children would thrive. Since then, I've experienced both kindness and prejudice. Some welcomed us with open arms. Others made it clear they thought we didn't belong." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Several people shifted in their seats. "Last week, an incident occurred that could have divided this town further," Marcus continued. "I was assaulted in my own driveway by a neighbor who didn't recognize me as the new chief of police." Whispers rippled through the crowd. All eyes turned to the back of the room, where Richard Coleman stood against the wall, his face pale. "I had a choice to make," Marcus said. "Press charges, or find another way forward. After much thought, I chose the latter, because a community isn't strengthened by punishment alone, but by understanding and growth." Marcus explained the program he had developed instead, a community dialogue series where residents could honestly discuss prejudice, fear, and mutual respect. Additionally, he announced new training for the police department focusing on community engagement across all backgrounds. "Change isn't easy," Marcus acknowledged. "It requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves. But if we can't do that, we can't grow." As he finished speaking, a movement at the back of the room caught everyone's attention. Richard Coleman was walking slowly toward the front, his usual confidence replaced by visible nervousness. Marcus nodded slightly, encouraging him to continue. Richard reached the microphone, hands trembling. I wasn't planning to speak tonight," he began awkwardly. "But after listening to Chief Johnson, I realized I needed to." He took a deep breath. "Many of you know me. I've lived in Oak Ridge for 30 years. What you might not know is that last week, I did something terrible. I vandalized Chief Johnson's car and attacked him when he confronted me." Gasps filled the room. Richard continued, his voice growing steadier. "I could be in jail right now. Instead, Chief Johnson offered me something harder, the chance to face my own prejudice. For the past week, I've been working with community leaders and and it's opened my eyes to things I didn't want to see about myself. Richard turned to face Marcus directly. I can't undo what I did, but I can say publicly that I was wrong about you, about your family, about what makes a community strong. And I'm sorry. The silence in the room was profound as Marcus stepped forward and extended his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Richard shook it. That handshake became a powerful symbol in Oak Ridge over the following months. The Community Dialogue program saw growing attendance each week. Officer training expanded to include regular neighborhood outreach events. Most surprisingly to everyone, Richard Coleman became one of the most committed volunteers, working especially with older residents who shared his initial resistance to change. 6 months later, when the Johnsons hosted a neighborhood barbecue, almost every family on the street attended. As Marcus watched his children playing with the other neighborhood kids, he caught Richard's eye across the yard. They nodded to each other, not as perfect friends, but as men engaged in the difficult, ongoing work of building something better than what came before. The transformation wasn't magical or complete. Prejudice didn't disappear overnight, but in Oak Ridge, people were finally talking about it honestly, and that was the first step toward real change.